Back in December of 2014, I was 22 years old. Feels like a lifetime ago, but it was just a short 10 years ago. Time goes fast when you're alive. Near the end of that year, in fact, on December 28th, 2014, something happened that really affected me quite profoundly, if I'm honest, to the point where it makes me sad even to this day. So I'm going to offer a content warning here. Right at the start of the video, I'm going to talk about depression and suicide, themes that run throughout the entire video essay from beginning to end, because I want to talk a little bit about Leelah Alcorn. 10 years ago, at 2:20 a.m. on December 28th, 2014, Leelah Alcorn walked into oncoming traffic on the southbound lanes of I-71 near her hometown of Kings Mills, Ohio, and was struck and killed by a tractor trailer. This was an intentional suicide, corroborated by her suicide letter that was scheduled to be posted on her Tumblr page at 5:30 p.m. on the same day. This was both the tragic end and, in a way, the beginning of her story. Before her passing, I hadn't really considered trans people and trans issues as all that important, at least not on their own. I didn't consider trans people and trans rights separately, and I didn't really understand or think much about trans people, having only recently learned about their existence. They were kind of folded into the broader category of LGBTQ, sidelined by gay rights, which was something I understood, at least better. Two people love each other. What could be easier to understand than that? And I felt I could argue for that. Not strange, considering the front line of the culture war in the US at the time was marriage equality for same-sex couples. And as such, this was also the front line of the culture war online because of how Americentric the internet is, unfortunately. Leelah kind of changed that for me, or she was the spark. Trans rights have become a significantly more important piece of my political ideology over time, in large part as a response to the ever-increasing presence of transphobic fascism that needs to be countered, but Leelah's story was an early radicalizing moment for me. So I wanted to commemorate her 10 years after her passing. To do that, we need to go back to the start. Who was Leelah Alcorn? She was a transgender girl born in Kingsmill, Ohio on November 15th, 1997. Just a few years younger than me and born in the same month as me. She was a beautiful young soul who by all means should still be alive today, 27 years old, but she's not. She died, barely 17 years old. Since the age of 4, she already felt like a girl trapped in a boy's body, long before knowing about the word transgender, before knowing that was even a thing that was real and valid. It turns out being trans isn't something you're groomed into, but a sense of self that comes from within. Because of this, she kept living as a boy, trying to fit in as best she could, all the while being miserable on the inside, until the age of 14 when she learned what transgender even was, that this feeling she had inside wasn't something wrong with her, it was something real and valid, who she was. She said that after learning what transgender meant, she cried of happiness, now that she, after 10 years of confusion, finally understood who she was. I don't know what that must have felt like. I've never experienced anything similar. I don't think relief does it justice. On some level, perhaps other trans people are the only ones who can really truly understand, but just imagine for a moment constantly holding up the crushing weight of the body you live in, feeling wrong and uncomfortable without any explanation as to why. Something straight out of a Kafka narrative. Just imagine feeling hopelessly lost and alone, carrying this weight that is suffocating any happiness you might find, seeping into and poisoning every moment of would-be joy, twisting every memory that would otherwise be happy into something dark and unrecognizable, because every memory you have is of a version of yourself that you don't want to recognize. Just imagine feeling like you want to crawl out of your skin because it's wrapped so tightly it might suffocate you, but there's no escape, no light at the end of the tunnel, no relief anywhere to be found. And imagine you're just a kid 14 years old, dealing with this on your own, without any support. Then one day you learn that you're not alone, that there are others who feel the same way, and that there is a way for you to exist that aligns more closely to that unyielding feeling you have inside, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that there's support and acceptance to be found, that you're valid, that you're not just a freak who's inexplicably being suffocated by your own body, that you're transgender. I don't know. I can't know what that's like, but I can imagine. I can imagine what that moment must have felt like for Leelah, probably one of the most profoundly powerful moments she ever experienced in her short time here on this earth. But it wouldn't last long. After finding out, she immediately told her mom, who reacted just as you'd expect a conservative Christian to react. It's a phase. You will never truly be a girl. God doesn't make mistakes. You're wrong. Imagine again being Leelah, a child of 14 whose entire existence so far had been tarnished by this deep, unyielding grief caused by the disconnect between who she was inside and who she appeared to be on the outside. Imagine the profound joy and hope she must have experienced when she made her earth-shattering discovery that she wasn't alone and broken, but in fact completely valid, and that others shared her experiences. Imagine the excitement to share this burst of positive, raw emotion that she might not ever have felt before, at any point before or after. And then imagine the gut punch of the one person in the whole world who was supposed to love her and support her, her mother, telling her that she was wrong and an affront to God. Imagine finding out your own mother doesn't even care about your feelings or who you are. Imagine this feeling she lived with her entire life, for as long as she could remember, the dark cloud that followed her no matter where she went or what she did, a dark cloud that could have been turned into a beautiful rainbow with just a little bit of sunshine, but instead she was told it was a phase, something wrong to get over, something unholy and sinful. I think Leelah said it best herself. Quote, "If you are reading this, parents, please don't tell this to your kids. Even if you are Christian or are against transgender people, don't ever say that to someone, especially your kid. That won't do anything but make them hate themselves. That's exactly what it did to me." End quote. See, that's the thing. It doesn't matter how profound or powerful something is if you don't have the love and support of those closest to you, especially as a child who relies on her parents for love and support. The kind of rejection Leelah faced from her mother would be enough to shatter any child into 1,000 pieces. It didn't get any better from there. In fact, the abuse that Leelah faced only escalated. Her mother started taking her to Christian so-called therapists who told her she was selfish and wrong and that she should look to God for help. Does that sound like therapy, moralizing and shaming her? Does that sound helpful to someone struggling with mental health? Or does it sound like these so-called therapists in a very direct way contributed to the social pressure that eventually killed her? Doesn't it sound like they were doing a little bit of conversion therapy, which is essentially a form of psychological torture? sometimes physical torture, but in the case of Leelah, it sounds as if it didn't go beyond verbal abuse. Not that that made it any better in the end. I know a lot of anti-human reactionaries love to pretend that words are just words and that words alone can't be abusive, that people who are hurt by words are just weak, but well, there's a reason I call them anti-human reactionaries, because that false narrative is just a fundamental rejection of how humans very obviously function, empirically and observably so, and it relies on the thought-terminating cliché that feelings, our internal worlds, are unimportant and irrelevant for some reason. But there isn't a person on this earth who could go through what Leelah did without coming out the other end broken and damaged, except literal psychopaths, I suppose. Remember, she was completely powerless, still a child, and all the adults around her were telling her she was wrong, not just about something, but about the very fabrics of her being, about her feelings and her internal world. They were telling her she was an affront to God, essentially that she was an abomination, something unholy and wicked that didn't deserve to exist. If you think that you'd make it through what she did and come out whole on the other side, with all due respect, which is none, but you're wrong, and you're either lying to yourself or everyone else. I remember at this time when I was annoyed at insensitive people moralizing about how wrong it is to commit suicide, I came across perhaps the single best comic strip I've ever seen explaining depression perfectly without a single written word. This one. And I also really like what a colleague of mine has said about hurtful words, how she explained it to the kids we work with, that they might not hurt the first or second time, but much like if you hit the same spot over and over again, it will eventually get sore, and something that didn't hurt the first time will hurt more and more if you keep poking at it 10 times, 20 times, 100 times, or if you have to live with it every second of every day. Humans aren't robots, and it's not weak to have feelings, just as it's not weak to have pain receptors. But let's continue. At 16 years old, Leelah realized that her parents would never support her or love her for who she was, that she wouldn't be able to do any transitioning treatment until she was 18. She cried herself to sleep on her 16th birthday, after her parents didn't consent for her to start transitioning. This absolutely broke her heart, as she said, because the longer you wait, the harder it is to transition. I assume she was thinking about the prospect of fully going through male puberty and being unhappy with that fact. At this point, she felt hopeless and feared she would just look like a man in drag for the rest of her life. After this, she formed a sort of a fuck you attitude towards her parents and decided to start socially transitioning at school. She initially came out as gay to ease into coming out as trans. Her friends were supportive, but her parents viewed her as an embarrassment to them and felt like she was attacking their image because they wanted her to be their perfect little straight Christian boy, which she wasn't and could never be, because that's not who she was. You can't bully someone into being something other than themselves. You can't abuse an immutable characteristic out of someone. So what did the abusive parents do in response? They isolated her from all her friends and anyone who might have been even slightly supportive of her. They took her out of public school, confiscated her laptop and phone, and forbade her from using social media. This was the single worst thing they could have done at this point to their transgender daughter, who was struggling with gender dysphoria and the depression that comes with it, all on her own. This was when she felt the most depressed at any point in her life, as expressed by Leelah herself. Quote, "I was completely alone for 5 months. No friends, no support, no love, just my parents' disappointment and the cruelty of loneliness. I'm surprised I didn't kill myself." End quote. This, as far as I'm concerned, was another form of torture, mimicking a form of solitary confinement. Loneliness has many extremely negative mental health effects, including suicidal ideation, and, as we're about to find out, hypervigilance, which can lead to excessive cynicism and suspicion of other people. Okay, but Leelah wasn't alone, right? She had her parents with her. Well, your abusers don't really count. Loneliness isn't when you are literally alone. Loneliness is a feeling, a state of mind. Being trapped with two people who do nothing but hurt you can indeed be a very lonely experience. That experience was the beginning of the end for Leelah. She spent the better part of her last year alive alone, without any support or love, a prisoner in a cell of her parents' design. Eventually, her parents did let her have her phone back at the end of the school year, which would have been maybe May or June of 2014. She expressed excitement over the prospect of having her friends back, but that didn't last because Leelah felt that they realized they didn't actually give a shit about her, and she felt even lonelier than she did before. I don't know exactly what happened there, but I have a couple of thoughts. The first thought is exactly what I just talked about, that long periods of loneliness can cause suspicion of other people. The second thought is that I recognize a tendency that is common in people who are severely depressed, namely that they have convinced themselves, or their depression has convinced them, that nobody likes them and that nobody ever could like them, regardless of whether that is actually true or not. She didn't explicitly detail what, if anything, her friends did wrong, like she did with her parents, so it's possible that this was her depression being projected onto other people. I don't know, and I don't think it matters all too much anyway. In the face of the persistent cruelty shown toward her by her parents and by her broader community that refused to engage with her as the person she was and instead tried to force her to conform and fit the mold, a handful of teenagers falling out of friendship doesn't seem like the big bad of it all. Regardless, at this point, everything Leelah was carrying on her own was getting to be too heavy for her. All the usual pressures teenagers faced, like grades, college, moving out, and the money needed for all of that. All the social pressures she faced because she was a trans girl, like keeping up appearances in a community that resented who she was, with parents who made sure she knew they felt she was an embarrassment to them, and also the internal pressures caused by gender dysphoria and declining mental health, thoughts about how she was never going to transition successfully, that she was never going to be happy with the way she looked or sounded, that she would never have enough friends or love to satisfy her. Toward the end of her suicide letter, she wrote, quote, "Either I live the rest of my life as a lonely man who wishes he were a woman, or I live my life as a lonelier woman who hates herself. There's no winning. There's no way out." End quote. After reading through the end of the letter, bar the last paragraph, which we'll get to in a minute, I want to now read the very first lines. Leelah opened the letter with the following, quote, "Please don't be sad. It's for the better. The life I would have lived isn't worth living in because I'm transgender." End quote. I think this is an important line, not because she's correct. I don't think she is, although obviously I can't speak for her or any other trans people. Being trans will probably always make life harder, but there is joy to be found in life, especially with supportive friends and family and a culture and society that humanize and help you instead of dehumanize and hurt you. But it's an important line because this is how society and her parents made her feel. Suicidality is not caused by transgenderism. It's caused by how people and society treat trans people. Indeed, Leelah echoed this sentiment in the very last paragraph, where she wrote, quote, "That's the gist of it. That's why I feel like killing myself. Sorry if that's not a good enough reason for you. It's good enough for me. As for my will, I want 100% of the things that I legally own to be sold and the money plus my money in the bank to be given to trans civil rights movements and support groups. I don't give a shit which one. The only way I will rest in peace is if one day transgender people aren't treated the way I was. They're treated like humans, with valid feelings and human rights. Gender needs to be taught about in schools. The earlier the better. My death needs to mean something. My death needs to be counted in the number of transgender people who commit suicide this year. I want someone to look at that number and say that's fucked up and fix it. Fix society, please." End quote. That's the lesson I've carried with me since December 28th, 2014, and it's what I'll continue carrying forward another 10 years and onward. So let's talk a little bit about the response to her passing. It made international news after all. There was a guy over here in Sweden who almost fell off his polar bear when he heard about it. Oh yeah, that was me. That was the dumbest joke ever. I want to start where it began, with her parents. That's not entirely fair because they are, after all, a product of the society they were born into. Transphobia is a systemic issue, not just an interpersonal one. But they did play a massive role in applying the social pressures that eventually killed their daughter, what with all the conversion therapy and hostility. So, did they learn their lesson? No, actually, they did not. They doubled down on refusing to accept her for who she was because they didn't support that religiously. They gave a bunch of tone-deaf statements in which they dead-named and misgendered Leelah while saying that they loved her, although they didn't say her. The mother referred to her as a boy and as her son, whom she supposedly loved unconditionally. And it was very important for the mother that people know that, as if the great tragedy of Leelah's life is that strangers like me might think her mother didn't love her. The tragedy is that even in death, her parents refused to see her. Instead, they chose to be willfully blind so that they could at least have the memory of a dead son to love. I want to nitpick a little bit now, because there were a couple of quotes on Wikipedia that kind of bothered me because of a shared and low-key problematic through line. The first line is a quote by Mary Elizabeth Williams, who wrote for Salon, quote, "It would be cruel and inaccurate to suggest that Carla Alcorn did not love her child," end quote. She further commented about the mother saying that she loved Leelah unconditionally, that it revealed, quote, "a tragic lack of understanding of the word unconditionally, even in death," end quote. The second quote is of Johanna Olsen, medical director for the Center of Trans Youth Health and Development at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, that's a mouthful, who said, quote, "Did Leelah's parents love her? Yes, I'm sure they did. Did they support her? No, they didn't, and that's a tragedy," end quote. The through line here is that the parents loved Leelah but didn't support her, and I just don't think that's true. Look, I don't want to imply that the quoted people are bad or anything. In fact, they seem like very nice people who are obviously on the side of trans people, but to be pedantic and nitpick a little bit, no, Leelah's parents did in fact not love her. Like a lot of right-wing parents, they felt a possessive kind of attachment to the idea of Leelah as their son. My cat is meowing outside. Still meowing. Hang on. Hey, Miffles, say hi to the camera. Yeah. All right. Off you go. Off you go. Where were we? Oh yeah. Like a lot of right-wing parents, they felt a possessive kind of attachment. Damn it, Miffles. Like a lot of right-wing parents, they felt a possessive kind of attachment to the idea of Leelah as their son. That's not love. They viewed Leelah as a prop, an extension of themselves that was obligated to be who they wanted her to be, not who she was or who she wanted to be. That's not love. They hated who she was, so much so that they bullied the will to live out of her. My DNA created this, therefore I feel attachment to it, is not love. A proper quote would be something along the lines of, did Leelah's parents love her? No, but I'm sure they thought they did. I really hate the pervasive idea that attachment is love. You can't love someone you don't respect or whose very being you find offensive or try to outright deny or eradicate. But what do I know? Obviously, I don't have any direct insight into the minds of Carla or Doug Alcorn, nor am I even interested in that because they are, at the end of the day, just two people who existed within a cultural and religious framework. I don't know what they felt or thought, but I have a philosophical disagreement with the notion that love can exist without respect. It can't. What I do love is that the people who edited Leelah's Wikipedia page fixed her parents' dead naming and misgendering of her by using brackets. That I respect, and respect is the foundation of love. That's why I love my cat, even when she wakes me up by sitting on my face in the middle of the night. Do I love her stinky butt rubbing up against my nose? No, but I respect the game. She knows how to get the food and the belly rubs. Anyway, I don't want to dwell too much on the parents. Leelah wanted her death to mean something, and it did. To hundreds of thousands of people across the world, to the 97,039 people who signed a petition for the right name to be put on the tombstone, a petition the parents sadly ignored, to the 353,128 people who signed a petition to enact Leelah's law to ban transgender conversion therapy, which saw some movement in that direction, including President Obama calling for the banning of conversion therapy for minors, even though conversion therapy sadly remains a massive problem to this day. To the many, many people who raised their voices in support of Leelah, to the people across the world who showed their support and solidarity, and to me, as one of those people. That's powerful. It was a powerful moment in history. For me, it was perhaps the catalyst that really got me invested in trans rights, as I said, a radicalizing event. Sometimes you see these tweets about what radicalized you and made you a leftist, and it's just empathy. I was already fairly invested in LGBTQ rights at the time, especially as an edgy new atheist who despised Christofascism and its homophobic, theocratic vision for society, but Leelah's story really got underneath my skin, not because her story was so exceptional, but because it wasn't. As she said herself, she wanted to be counted in the number of transgender people who committed suicide that year. As in, there's more. If we look at Statista, we can see that in 2014, 79% of trans people considered suicide, 39% attempted suicide. God knows how many succeeded. Leelah was right. That is fucked up. And we need to fix that. The only way to do that is with understanding and empathy. Reactionaries sometimes pretend that they oppose transgenderism because it's a mental illness that is harmful to those who have it, usually accompanied with narratives about grooming with the purpose of stigmatizing trans people's existence in public life. That's not really why they hate trans people. They hate trans people because they view them as impure degenerates who represent a chaotic threat to their ordered and hierarchical world. But they like to pretend. That narrative allows them to feel like heroes and saviors who are not just protecting women and children, but also trans people from themselves, their own impurity and sin. The only problem is that their attitude is what drives trans people to these dark places of depression and suicidal ideation, whereas gender-affirming attitudes and gender-affirming care have been proven time and time again by virtually all research that's out there to increase happiness and reduce suicidal ideation. That's because gender identity is not a mental illness. It's an immutable characteristic that's totally normal. You can't bully an immutable characteristic out of someone, and people feel happy, even if their lives aren't perfect, when they have people who love and support them, when they feel safe and respected by their neighbors and fellow human beings. I don't think that's very hard to understand. It's quite intuitive. If you push someone down over and over again, you might eventually kill them. But if you lift them up, maybe you can save a life. It's been 10 years since Leelah's death, but her words still ring just as true today as they did back then, maybe even more so in a way, now that the reactionary political movement has fanned the flames of moral panic over the existence of trans people and made it a public culture war issue where they want society to be proactively hostile rather than reactively antagonistic. Back on January 1st, 2015, in the aftermath of Leelah's tragic suicide, I wrote a blog post titled LGBT Rights Long Overdue on my bad blog that no longer exists. My writing was not the best, I suppose, and you'll have to excuse my edgy new atheism, but I wrote the following. 2015 does not start well. I recently learned of Leelah Alcorn's suicide. For those of you who do not know, she was a transgender girl trapped in a boy's body, who was essentially bullied by her intolerant Christian parents until she committed suicide on December 28th. In her heartbreaking suicide note, which you can read below, she wrote, quote, "My death must mean something." Indeed, her death does mean something. Her death means social issues are important. Everyone should be allowed to be who they are, regardless of who they are. Nobody should be driven to suicide, especially not by the two people who should be a supportive safety net throughout life, parents. Her death means that ancient religious morality has no place in modern society. Her death, and many others too, means the time for change was long ago. Leelah's story literally brought tears to my eyes. Shit like this cannot happen. Change is long overdue. And when conservative Christians comment horrific things like that they too would kill themselves if they thought they were transgender, I can feel my anger boiling right beneath the surface. It's a human being of whom they speak. Yes, I wrote of whom they speak. I was 22, okay? Not a monster. It's a young person with her whole life in front of her who ended that life because of a culture of hate. No one is interested in lazy answers like, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but God. Accept your child for who they are, whoever they are. If your faith makes you kill your child, your faith is obviously wrong. The year 2015 has just started, and more of this will follow. Ignorant bigotry must go away. It doesn't help that Leelah's parents keep disrespecting her even when she's gone, referring to her as a boy, burying her in a suit, and even deluding themselves or trying to delude others as to the nature of her death. Her mother said, "He was out for a walk and got hit by a truck," as if it were accidental. Leelah's parents ought to be tried for child abuse and causing their daughter's death. Actually, other than the of whom they speak, maybe I wasn't such a bad writer after all. I was spitting fire there. To be fair, what I said about the parents implying her suicide was an accident was based on a since deleted Facebook post that the mother wrote at 2:56 p.m. on December 28th, 2014. But the suicide note wasn't scheduled by Leelah to be published until 5:30 p.m. on that same day. So I don't think that accusation is fair, but everything else I said was on point. Trans rights, as well as LGBTQ rights broadly, were already long overdue in 2014 when Leelah died. It's now, well, I was going to say 2024 because that looks good, 2014 to 2024, but I took so damn long to make this damn video essay that it's already 2025 somehow. I can't believe a whole year came and went. Shit's crazy. Anyway, it's been another 10 years, and in some ways, things have gotten better, what with representation in art and culture. There's a lot more knowledge about and visibility for trans people now. I don't even remember trans or non-binary people being mentioned when I was a teenager, but one of my closest friends from that time has since come out as non-binary and asexual, and, well, it actually makes a lot of sense in hindsight. But we're currently backsliding pretty hard. Pixar walking back on a storyline about a trans kid, for example, journalists and media spending the last few years questioning whether trans women pose a threat to cis women under the guise of just asking questions, as another example. Virulent, fanatical anti-trans extremism growing bolder, louder, more normalized, and finding a home in institutional political parties, as a third example, or, I forget her name. You know that children's author who was so beloved by an entire generation of people that they were willfully blind to the pro-slavery messages in her children's books, but she has spent the last few years burning down her entire legacy over her hatred of trans people. You know who I'm talking about? It doesn't matter. Who cares? Things are getting worse, is what I'm saying. I don't think it's hopeless. I don't think most people are virulently transphobic. I do think better things are possible, but we are, right now, in a very uncertain and dangerous moment. And it's okay to be scared. It is scary if you're a trans person. But that's why I think it's so important for people like me, cis men, the group that statistically is the most transphobic, by far the most reactionary broadly, to speak out and show that there are people out there who care, not just as an abstract idea, but as a person with a face and a name. I learned Leelah's lesson 10 years ago. I will not sit silently as people suffer. I remember back then in 2014 and probably in early 2015 seeing a lot of reactionaries salivating over her death, happy to be rid of another degenerate freak, finding joy in the misery and death of someone they deemed inferior. The ones who still wore human masks instead chose to tut-tut over her actions, saying it was selfish of her to end her own life, selfish to use someone else's vehicle as a tool to end her life, as if depression and suicidality are entirely rational modes of behavior that she, still a child at just 17, chose to engage in, and not the end result of a society, a culture, and even a family, specifically the parents, that bullied her and pushed her down for who she was. There's not a person alive who would thrive in that environment, in an environment that reminds you every second of every minute of every hour of every day that you are not accepted, not wanted, not loved. That there's something so profoundly wrong with you that even your parents won't love you. That is an environment that is designed to kill. Not a cis guy like me, but anyone who is the least bit abnormal, anyone who doesn't fit the mold, anyone who can be othered and vilified for their nonconformity. And mind you, nonconformity in this context means having an immutable characteristic that you can't choose not to have, even if you wanted to. The purpose of a system is what it does, and the purpose of transphobic social norms and systems is to kill trans people. Let's at least all be honest about that, as we're staring down the barrel of Western governments falling to reactionary fascist takeovers and the looming threat of legal eradication of transgenderism. Eradication of transgenderism means the eradication of human beings like Leelah. Don't look away from that fact. I guess I just wanted to take however many minutes this video ends up being at this very precarious moment in history to remember Leelah. As a human being whose life mattered, not just in the abstract, but as a direct and powerful influence on me and my values and beliefs. So, thank you, Leelah. You never met me, you never knew me, but I'll always remember you and carry with me the lesson you taught. I will never turn my back on a person who needs to be seen, validated, and accepted. I know it won't always feel like it, but you, yes, you, are seen. I do see you. You are valid just as you are, and there is a place for you here on this earth. The sad part is that Leelah's Tumblr page doesn't exist anymore. The link to her suicide letter leads to a screen telling you there's nothing there, before quickly redirecting you to the Tumblr homepage. I don't know why, but that hit me kind of hard. I guess nothing lasts forever, not even on the internet. Atrophy eats up everything. Everything wastes away and is forgotten. 10 years after her death, maybe Leelah Alcorn has been forgotten. There's a sadness to that. Now she's just an artifact of the past that's been lost and buried underneath the unyielding march of time and the corpses of 1,000 dead trans kids taken from the world through the kind of social violence that pushes kids into the deep pits of depression and ultimately suicide, or by the kind of stochastic violence that the reactionary anti-trans movement has stoked at every turn, like we saw with the murder of Brianna J. Maybe the world has forgotten Leelah, but I haven't forgotten her, and I never will until the day I die. I think everybody deserves to be remembered. I guess that's a little bit naive because all of us will eventually fade into obscurity. If not in 10 years, then in 10 generations, probably far, far fewer. But it's not yet time for Leelah to be forgotten or fade into obscurity. She should still be remembered. And this video essay is my small part in helping keep her story, her memory, and her legacy alive. Thank you so much for watching. This was kind of a heavy episode, so if you stuck with me all the way to the end, I appreciate that. I wanted to have the episode done for the 10th anniversary of her tragic passing, but Christmas and all the social expectations that go with it have eaten up much of my time. As usual, remember to like and subscribe if you have any thoughts, or if, like me, you are now in your 30s and you remember Leelah, share below in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.